Hey, folks. Zach Osterman here, IU Insider, Indianapolis Star. This is Mind Your Manners special for September 25th, 2025. Going to do a few more of these this season, certainly as interest kind of continues to ramp up in the still undefeated Indiana Hoosiers football team. And this weekend, IU has obviously a difficult first road test at Kinnick Stadium, the stadium where Jim Harbaugh once proclaimed top five teams go to die. Indiana is not quite a top five team, but certainly has those kinds of ambitions, and therefore will be taking this game very seriously. And to help us preview it is an old friend, Tyler Tachman. Many of you will remember Tyler from his time with us covering Indiana when he was a student. He's now a working man, just like the rest of us, covering Iowa for the Des Moines Register. Tyler, how are we doing? Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, I'm doing good. I'm wondering if, I'm covering against the place that I went to school. Do I get my diploma taken away, or my student loans going to go up? Or I'm curious if that dynamic is going to change anything in terms of my status as an IU alum. Hopefully my tuition doesn't go up, or student loan. But
I think your student loans are always going up. I think that's just a fact of life, unfortunately, in 2025. But other than that, I don't think anybody's going to hold anything against you. You have been around this team, obviously, for a couple of years now, around this program. And I guess the first question is, and I know there's kind of always this, Iowa's sort of become almost like a program unto itself, and Kirk Ferentz has been there for so long, and there is this sort of perception that Iowa still plays power football, and they do, but I do think it's worth saying, that the Iowa State game, they only score 13, they lose, but their other three games, 34 points, 47 points, 38 points. I understand in a couple of those, you're allowed to sort of acknowledge the competition, but just early on this season, 1/3 of the way through, how is kind of the discussion shaped up around this team, and what are maybe expectations, I guess, for lack of a better term, from fans, as this season moves into the fall?
yeah, I think even 4 games into the season, it's still kind of unknown where Iowa stands. Like we don't really know how good this team will be, and the Indiana game is certainly going to be a good kind of litmus test to that. But if I run through offensively real quick, you know, um, by far their biggest strength is the offensive line. That they have some veterans there. That's been their best position group probably on the entire team this season. Running game is good in part because of that offensive line, and Tim Lester, who is now in his second season as offensive coordinator, he really sparked some offensive progress last season with Caleb Johnson, who went on to be drafted by the Pittsburgh Steelers. The passing game is kind of what is lagging behind right now. It got a lot better versus Rutgers. There was some legitimate signs of life with Mark Gronowski, who came in from South Dakota State. He has a winning pedigree, but the receiving game, the tight end game, which has, Iowa is kind of known for, it's built a good reputation of having good tight ends. That's been the kind of thing that's been holding Iowa's offense back this season in that Iowa State game, and then especially last season. So offensively, that's where they're at. Defensively, I think usually you're like Iowa will likely the defense will likely keep it in a game like this against Indiana, but that's not exactly the case this season. They lost a lot of production from last season. If you follow the Big Ten pretty closely, you probably know the name Jay Higgins. They lost him, but also a handful of other defenders from that were really key last season. So there's a handful of new faces on Iowa's defense. They played really well the first 3 games of the season, and they kept Iowa State to just 16 points, a really good quarterback in Rocco Beck. But against Rutgers, they allowed 21 points in the first half and really got the ball thrown at them around the yard, which was concerning given what they're going up against Indiana on Saturday in the passing attack with Fernando Mendoza. So this is a team that there's some places where game experience is lacking for Iowa, and they've been like solid in patches through the first 4 games. There's also been areas of concern. So we're still, I don't think we're definitively know at this point, like how good or how bad Iowa is.
I want to focus on, I guess, the two Power Five games first, because it seems to me the complexion of them is very different. They're both on the road. It's worth saying, Iowa has been on the road now twice, and once in a particularly difficult environment. Indiana's not been on the road yet, so that's sort of advantage Iowa. You talk about that Iowa State game, and I know that the Cy-Hawk Trophy sometimes just gets low scoring. But from your perspective, especially against a good established quarterback, when you look at Iowa's numbers, they don't have a ton of sacks, tackles for loss, turnovers forced. So it's not like you can point to one thing and say that's how they disrupt an offense, that's how they disrupt a pass game. What was it in that game that just kind of kept Rocco Becht from ever really getting – I mean, he didn't have a terrible game, but only 134 yards of passing, 18 to 27, one touchdown. Like what in that game really doesn't allow Becht to ever kind of find the kind of rhythm that lets Iowa State get going offensively?
They didn't allow any like really big plays. Like they did a great job of limiting that. Most of the stuff was shorter, and the secondary was tested. That was one of the bigger questions for Iowa coming into the season. But TJ Hall, who's a veteran guy in terms of time in the program, but hasn't like really emerged as a high level cornerback that Iowa is used to having. He played really well, and the secondary as a whole kind of proved itself for the first time. It's a younger secondary. They have basically two cornerbacks who came in with some questions coming into the season around them. Same thing with Cash, which is kind of like a hybrid that Iowa plays as like a linebacker and safety. And then and one of their safeties is his first season as a full-time starter. But Iowa did a great job of just limiting the big plays. And I think that's a big concern for Iowa entering the game against Indiana, is like you just cannot let Fernando Mendoza connect on those deep balls with Omar Cooper Jr. or Elijah Surratt or guys of that nature. So they did a great job of limiting the big plays, getting off the field. They made some really timely like pass breakups. They were tested, and they just didn't let Rocco Becht get into a real rhythm. So it was, they didn't. And then the other thing was they forced a turnover on special teams, which also kind of swung things in their favor. But it was just a really solid game. It wasn't like they didn't do anything especially flashy, but it was just, I think, really good execution and good play in the secondary, which wasn't the case as much so against Rutgers.
It's interesting you mentioned limiting big plays. That's obviously been a strength for Indiana this season, and it strikes me that Iowa is one of the best teams in the conference in terms of long scrimmage plays allowed. They are first in the conference in explosive rushing plays allowed. They've only allowed 4 rushes of 10-plus yards. They have not allowed a rush of 20-plus yards. For perspective on the other side, and again, allow for the opponent, but we also saw what Indiana did last week against Illinois. Indiana has 36 rushes of 10-plus yards, 13 rushes of 20-plus yards, and 5 rushes of 30-plus yards. A number like Indiana's basically already produced almost as many explosive run plays in terms of 20, 30, 40-plus this year as they did all of last season. That is a sort of an emerging sort of new strength for this group. What has – and I want to get your thoughts on kind of what maybe didn't go as well defensively against Rutgers in a second, but what about this? Is it structure? Is it, you talk about maybe having to reload personnel a little bit. Iowa has always been good against the run, but to me, that is an area where I think, I look at that Iowa State game, I look at this matchup, and I do wonder if that's an area where Iowa says we give ourselves a chance if we win that battle of holding Indiana back in terms of not allowing those explosive run plays.
Yeah, I would say the defensive line is probably Iowa's strongest position group defensively. They have Aaron Graves on the interior, who is he did a great job getting penetration against Iowa State. And he is just a physical presence. Then they have more depth than they did last season on the defensive line. They have some pretty good pass rushers on the edge, Max Llewellyn and Ethan Herkett. Another guy, Brian Allen, who can kind of play inside and outside. But I would just say the defensive line, and then they have 2 transfers, Bryce Hawthorne and Jonah Pace, who have been factors early on. So I just say one is scheme, is that Iowa, just in general does a pretty good job of stopping the run, and that's kind of what their defensive line, that's their priority before getting to the quarterback, is stopping the run. So part of it is Phil Parker's scheme defensively, but also that's the position group defensively that they have the most experience, and I would say probably the most depth. So that I would kind of say that that's the reason that Iowa has done a pretty good job stopping the run so far this season.
Talk about that Rutgers game. Ethan Kaliakmakis, the Greek Rifle, one of my favorite nicknames in all of Big Ten football this year. You talk about, in that game, I know Iowa obviously has a special teams touchdown. It's worth saying Iowa really winds up closing that game very, very well, outscores Rutgers 17-7 in the fourth quarter. And again, that is on the road. Kaliakmakis doesn't throw a touchdown pass, but he is 24 of 40 for 330 yards. That's a pretty crooked number against an Iowa defense. And again, if we're going to talk about sort of the long scrimmage plays, Iowa's very good against the run. They aren't terrible against the pass, but they are a little bit kind of more middle of the road in terms of they have allowed some big chunk plays, 22 plays of 10-plus yards through the air, 10 plays of 20-plus yards through the air, 4 of 30-plus yards, 2 of 40-plus yards. They have allowed some big plays in the pass game, and obviously the Rutgers game maybe exposes a little bit more of that than most. What kind of goes wrong for them in terms of defending the pass and sort of slowing Kaliakmakis? It is worth saying he doesn't throw a touchdown pass. They do pick him off once, but what maybe, kind of how could they basically fail to disrupt him in that game, I guess is what I'm asking in terms of allowing him just such a large number of passing yards. It was a horribly phrased question.
No, you're good. But it was a lot of, the first quarter was horrible for Iowa defensively. The second quarter wasn't great either. They kind of settled in a little bit in the second half finally, but Rutgers scored touchdowns on its first 3 offensive drives of the game. So it was really early on in that game that hurt them. And it exposed some of, as media and fans are, worry about Iowa's secondary. And also there's a new group of linebackers. Iowa lost Nick Jackson, Jay Higgins, and Kyler Fisher, who are just real kind of stalwarts on that defensive unit. But it exposed what the worry was entering the season, was that Iowa's secondary and its ability to stop the pass could be a weakness. So Iowa did a really good job in that Iowa State game. But so part of the Rutgers thing was what Iowa brought on itself. It just from an execution standpoint, from a just the way that they got, they executed was not the way that they wanted to. But Rutgers was like almost flawless. Like Ethan Kaliakmakis is a really good quarterback. They have some legit receivers, and they just did a great job of executing what they needed to do. So it was in part, I think, to what Iowa was lacking. It was also in part to how good Rutgers is in the pass game. And I think those two things combined together kind of exposed, where Iowa maybe has some flaws. And that's why I think, Iowa was really good the first 3 games of the season defensively, really good. But just that one kind of bad half against Rutgers has resurfaced maybe some of that worry about, you go up against a team like Indiana, who has a lethal passing attack, arguably the best quarterback in the country. And that becomes, I think, a much bigger problem potentially because of what Rutgers was able to do in that first quarter and first half.
It is worth saying in that game, Iowa also sacks Kaliakmakis 3 times. Indiana's only allowed 3 sacks all season. So that's another one of those kind of, which something's got to give a little bit here. Iowa, I think, has 8 sacks in its last 2 games. I wanted to ask about Gronowski and kind of this idea that, he was obviously an incredibly successful quarterback where he'd been before. Kurt Cignetti talked this week about how he's I think one of the things Cignetti sort of highlighted first with Gronowski is just how much winning he's done. And Cignetti is one of those coaches that believes firmly in the idea that once you get in the habit of success, it tends to kind of follow you and it tends to breed on itself. I know Iowa has been hopeful that Gronowski maybe does add some dimensions to this offense. I think that's fair to say. And it's worth saying, I don't have sack adjusted yards in front of me. He's only thrown for 492 yards through 4 games. but he has gotten involved a little bit in the run game. If you look at, I think he has 6 rushing touchdowns, including 3 last weekend, had 55 yards rushing against Rutgers on 13 carries. Again, I don't have sack-adjusted yards, but I'm assuming that the rush yards probably are even the impact on the run game is probably even a little bit more impressive once you pull the sack numbers out. What has he brought to this group? And maybe how do you think Iowa wants to continue sort of expanding the ways that he can influence the offense, because he does have, sort of that dual threat capability?
Yeah, to, I guess, kind of just paint a picture of what he came into when he transferred to Iowa was like the quarterback play the last few seasons has been just a real sore spot. Cade McNamara wasn't what a lot of people hoped. There's been injuries. So he came into a place that was basically starving for at least competent quarterback play. And he, because of the resume he had at South Dakota State, winning 2 national titles there, he generated excitement coming into Iowa that he could change what has been a position that has been severely underwhelming. His very first game at Iowa against Albany it wasn't good at all. He was kind of wrecked by nerves, which was jarring to see a little bit for someone that's played so much college football. But since that game, he has gotten better in each of the 4 games. So he got better in the Iowa State game, even though Iowa lost. He got better in the UMass game, and then his best game of the season was against Rutgers. So there's been a progression of him steadily improving each week. And then certainly Indiana is going to be a major test to that trajectory. But one of his biggest weapons, I think, really is his ability to run. He's a physical runner. He's not fast, but he's faster for someone that's his size. He's a big guy. It's not easy to bring him down. Like, he's the type of guy that if he gets hit, he's going to fall forward typically. So it's not like you're going to rip, like I was used that in the red zone as well, around the goal line, with him basically just, taking the snap and doing like a quarterback power type deal. So that has been a real weapon. His passing has gotten better by each week, and it really finally kind of broke through against Rutgers and being able to hit some of those deeper balls. That's where I was really lacked, is the explosive passing plays. They found that against Rutgers on a more frequent basis, which was a very welcome development. In Iowa, against Iowa State, this is worth mentioning, is that they brought out the slow mesh a couple of times, which, if you're unfamiliar, it's basically like a slower version of a RPO. So Warren Ruggiero ran that at Wake Forest when he was their offensive coordinator. Iowa hired him as an analyst this offseason and have implemented that into the offensive scheme. So I wouldn't be surprised to see Iowa bring that out against Indiana. They didn't bring it out against Albany or UMass. They did against Iowa State. I could easily see Iowa trying to use it as in their advantage to catch Indiana flat-footed. It's something that's difficult to defend just because of how slow it is. It's basically Mark Gronowski keeping the ball in the running back's belly, and in the running back's stomach, until he sees Indiana make a decision of whether they're trying to stop the run or stop the pass. So Iowa will sprinkle in some more traditional RPOs as well. That's something that's part of Tim Lester's repertoire. So that's kind of where the passing game in Mark Gronowski stands through 4 games.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that, and I guess also about like other personnel that Indiana fans should know. But just, you mentioned the slow mesh. Essentially, ways you think Iowa might be a little bit less conventional with Gronowski, because it's one thing to have a rushing quarterback. It's another thing to have one you trust. It's another thing to have one that you're comfortable, allowing him to get hit, fairly consistently. It sounds like Iowa's not sort of bothered with Gronowski playing a little bit more physically within the position. But I think that's good insight just in terms of, maybe some things that Indiana has not seen before. They saw some mobile quarterback type stuff and frankly struggled against it in a couple spots against Old Dominion. Maybe they can pull back on some of that against Iowa. The other question I had was just, other personnel. I mean, it's worth saying, Iowa, I think Indiana fans will be well aware of sort of the cultural history of Iowa football, particularly offensively. They've got two different running backs that have each rushed for close to 200 yards already this season. You talk about using Gronowski in the red zone. He's their leader in rushing touchdowns. He's got 6 of their 10 rushing touchdowns, but that means there's 4 other players that have a rushing touchdown. They obviously have a real weapon in special teams. We saw that last weekend against Rutgers pretty much from the jump. But are there other kind of, I mean, I hate the phrase players to watch, but names that Indiana fans need to know ahead of this weekend?
Yeah, I would say Kamari Moulton, a running back. He was Iowa's starting running back to open the season, got hurt really early on, but he would be at the top of the list in terms of playmakers in the backfield. He played well. He returned against Rutgers after he got hurt, against Albany, and had a good game. He's someone I would definitely watch. In the receiving game, drops have been an issue. So that Mark Gronowski hadn't played great early on in the season, but Iowa's receivers, that's a major talking point right now, is the inability of Iowa's receivers to be able to hold up their end of the bargain. I would say Seth Anderson is one of the better receivers that Iowa has. Jacob Gill, Sam Phillips. They have some guys with some speed and some elusiveness. The problem has been simply catching the ball. So that's something that I think is a concern for Iowa moving forward. In terms of, also you mentioned special teams. Caden Weegan is the returner that they have, and if Indiana is smart, they're not going to let him get his hands on the ball if possible. He has 4 in his career. He has 2 punt return touchdowns, 2 kickoff return touchdowns. In each of the last 2 weeks, that he had a 95-yard punt return against UMass, and then he took one back in the opening kickoff against Rutgers. So he also contended. He did this happen in the Iowa State game. He can try to do a little bit too much and get himself into some trouble. So maybe Indiana tries to use his aggressiveness against him, or maybe they just try to keep the ball out of his hands in total. I'm trying to think else offensively. I mean, the offensive line has been really good. Logan Jones at center, probably one of the best centers in the country. Jennings Dunker. So that's an area where I think Iowa could have an advantage in the trenches. Like, I know Indiana's defensive line basically just wrecked Illinois, and that was basically the game. But Iowa is not. I could not see that. I doubt that's going to happen against Iowa. It'll be interesting to see kind of whether Iowa was able to keep that as a major advantage, because it has been typically the last 2 seasons. But yeah, and I touched on defensively a couple of the other key guys. Aaron Graves, someone in the secondary who is kind of knocking on the door of a really big play, is Cohen Entringer. He has some really just physically and intangibly is a pretty impressive guy. Still hasn't had a lot of game experience, but I would say those are some kind of names to know.
I should ask this just purely because we're doing kind of the scouting thing. Any injury concerns for Iowa heading into this weekend that you think make any real difference to this matchup?
Yeah, Jazz Patterson, he's actually Iowa's leading rusher. He's out. He got hurt in the Rutgers game, but I mean, you look at it on paper and he's Iowa's leading rusher in yardage, but Iowa has really gone like a backfield by committee. So it's not like a devastating injury. And like I said, Kamari Moulton was Iowa's starter to open the season. So that's not great, but it's also not going to totally keep Iowa behind the sticks. Xavier Williams, another running back, he's out. It sounds like Seth Anderson, who is one of Iowa's better receivers, he got dinged up in the Rutgers game. It sounds like he's going to be good to go. So there's been a few injuries here and there, but nothing that I would consider like especially devastating to Iowa.
I guess the last question I had is really a pretty basic one, but is, what is the feel around this game? I opened with that Jim Harbaugh quote, and we're to take people behind the scenes briefly. We're recording this on Thursday. It will go live on Friday. By that point, I'll have a story up on indystar.com/sports and insider that basically just sort of says, proving yourself in Iowa City is sort of a rite of passage for big time programs in the Big Ten, because it is one of those places where, if Iowa can suck you into playing their game And obviously the atmosphere, the stadium, all that stuff speaks for itself. But I'm just curious what, I imagine there's a difference between, number 2 Ohio State and number 11 Indiana. I know there's a healthy amount of respect within the program for what Curt Cignetti's done, but I'm just curious for just your take or your sort of observation on what the feel is around this game, both maybe internally within the program and then also just kind of within the fan base. Because on the one hand, you're playing a ranked team, you're playing a team that's done some impressive stuff the last couple seasons. But on the other hand, maybe it doesn't quite have the juice of Iowa, Penn State, or Iowa, Michigan, or is there still kind of that energy around a game like this? Do you think?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, it maybe doesn't have the traditional shine of like an Ohio State and a Penn State, but you would consider probably Indiana like a new blood if we're going to use that term in college football. I would say the Iowa fan base is starving for a win like this because they are 0-10 in the last against the last 10 ranked opponents. That's been something that has been brought up with pretty frequently. Iowa's like one of the most consistent programs, right? But there's also been a clear gap between where they are at and the more elite programs. So, but within that stat of the 10 losses in a row to ranked teams, only one has come at Kinnick Stadium. Almost all of them have come at either a neutral site or away. So Iowa hasn't had a ton of opportunities to beat ranked opponents with the home crowd behind them. So I would expect it to be an even crazier atmosphere because this is a fan base that so badly wants a win like this to kind of give reason to continue to believe in the program because it's gotten difficult over the last few years to believe that Iowa is capable of winning a game like this where there's some intrigue, some hype leading up to it. You have a legitimate college football playoff contender coming in, and the atmosphere is, I think, undoubtedly going into it Iowa's biggest advantage. You look at some areas, the offensive line, special teams, maybe historically the defense where Iowa could hold an advantage. But as you know, Indiana has looked most mortal, and that hasn't come often, but it's come in difficult road environments. Granted, it was against Ohio State and Notre Dame, but we've seen under Curt Cignetti, there's been when they've looked most vulnerable has been on difficult road environments. This is their first road environment this season. I would expect a Kinnick Stadium crowd that is craving and going to do everything in their power. I would almost liken it to an assembly hall when you just feel like the crowd almost wills, Indiana to at least stay competitive and stay in the game. I could see that happening at Kinnick. Iowa certainly is going to have to show up on the field and reciprocate that energy. But this is a fan base that really badly wants a win like this.
I guess this is maybe a neat way to wrap it up is, we've seen Indiana able to put up some crooked numbers, and obviously 63 last week against Illinois. They haven't scored less than 27 all season. Even if you go back to last year, they scored 47 at Michigan State. They scored 42 at UCLA. I think this is a better team than either of those teams, and certainly a tougher road environment. But I look at Iowa, and you've got the Iowa State game that maybe takes on a familiar pattern, and an unwelcome but familiar pattern for some Iowa fans. But then you also have a game where Iowa puts up 38, including 31 offensively at Rutgers just last weekend. Like, is there if Indiana gets to, let's say, 30, 35 points, do you think Iowa can score with Indiana, or do you think this needs to be a lower scoring game for Iowa to win it?
Well, last season, there would have been no chance that Iowa would have been able to keep up. I think it's more likely for them to be able to this season. That's kind of the dynamic with Iowa at this point is I'm not sure. Can you count on the defense more? Can you count, is maybe the offense going to have to take a bigger role than it has traditionally? Iowa is more likely to be able to hang in a shootout this season with Mark Gronowski at quarterback than it would have been able to last season or the season before. I think I think, ideally Iowa keeps it a low scoring game because that's just the bread and butter for Kirk Ferentz. But if it does balloon into a higher scoring game, we saw Iowa be able to come out and beat Rutgers on the road, which I think is an encouraging sign to the point that they can maybe win in a little bit of a different way than they have the last few seasons. On the same token, it wouldn't shock me. We know that Kurt Signetti, he's not going to take his foot off the gas pedal, right? Like if he's not going to feel bad for Iowa if they're getting boat raced at home and be like, we're just going to let it. Like I could see a world in which Indiana just beats the brakes off of Iowa if Iowa doesn't show up. But that said, I think I was a little bit more equipped to at least hang in there offensively if it does become a high scoring affair.
He's Howard Tachman from the Des Moines Register. I'm Zach Osterman from the Indianapolis Star. This has been Mind Your Banners, a Mind Your Banners special. Again, we're recording it on September 25th. You'll hear it starting September 26th. But thank you all so much for listening. Indiana at Iowa, 3:30 p.m. Saturday, 3:30 p.m. Eastern time, of course, 2:30 p.m. local in Iowa City. Games on Peacock, so you better go find a subscription or a login. Watch a little soccer Saturday morning. You know I'll be doing it. Thank you, Tyler, for joining us. Thank you all for listening. We will be back Saturday evening, I suppose, with our post-game podcast, rain or shine. But until then, for the Indianapolis Star, I'm Zach Osterman. We'll talk to you soon.